Hello YouTube, this is Sniper's End, and we're changing up my Unrelated series a bit. This time it's going to be Unrelated Rainbow Six Vegas. We'll be watching 5 current individual level world record runs on Bordertown, Dante's, both Kill Houses, and Red Lotus. If any of these records are beaten, I'll make a note of it in the description. Without further ado, today we're going to be talking about Alexander Graham Bell, and I want to start off with a quote from him. This is from a letter he wrote to his wife. "You must settle down the conviction that whatever success I may meet in life, your husband will be known as a teacher of the deaf." Think about that for a second. What do you know Alexander Graham Bell for? You might not know that Alexander Graham Bell, also known as Alec to his family, is a very controversial figure. In his days, if he wasn't tinkering with his inventions, he was probably teaching a deaf person or doing something related to the deaf community. He dedicated most of his life to the deaf, but today he is reviled by the deaf community. So what happened that made Alec reviled? Why is he so controversial? Before we get into that, let me introduce someone that's going to play a big part in this story. Meet Edward Gallaudet. If you know anything about the deaf community or deaf culture, you probably already know this name. Gallaudet University is the only university in the world where deaf and hard of hearing people can learn in American Sign Language. Edward Gallaudet was the founder and the first president of Gallaudet University. When Alec was young, his father discovered visible speech. It was a series of symbols that showed how to position the mouth to make sounds. The most commercially useful application of this ended up becoming teaching deaf people how to speak. Alec's mother and wife were both deaf, and he ended up taking several full-time jobs teaching the deaf in his lifetime. Back in these days, there were 2 competing methods of how to teach deaf people. One was the oral method, backed by Alec, where you teach the deaf how to speak and read lips. Then there was the combined method, backed by Edward Gallaudet, which had a much greater emphasis on sign language. The 2 different methods of deaf education came to a head in 1880 in the Second International Conference on the Education of the Deaf. At this conference, there were 164 delegates. Only one of these delegates was actually deaf. This conference overwhelmingly passed 8 resolutions. These resolutions stated that the oral method was superior and that sign language should not be taught. Then, in 1884, Alec wrote the Memoir upon the Formation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race. To start off with, the title alone is enough to make us cringe today, and it wasn't much better when the memoir was released. It brings thoughts of eugenics and, to a more extreme thought, Nazism. The deaf community was outraged when this was released because they thought it implied they were an inferior race. If you read the memoir, it implies this even further. The entire memoir is Alec's proposal of the idea that deafness is genetic, so we should avoid deaf intermarriage. He doesn't come out and say it, but he strongly implies that sign language, deaf schools, and deaf clubs are big reasons why deaf intermarriage is so common, and that steps should be taken to stop all of these. Finally, in 1890, Edward Gallaudet went to Congress to ask for $5,000 in order to start a deaf educator training program. Alec thought that Gallaudet was going to use this money in order to hire deaf teachers. This was unacceptable because Alec thought it would lead to sign language. So, Alec went to Congress and blew up Gallaudet's program. Alec and the Gallaudets were cordial up to this point, but after this, they were bitter rivals. Today, the Gallaudets and Gallaudet University are big names in deaf culture, and I believe that they were instrumental in ensuring no one forgot that Alec was on the wrong side of history. Today, the combined method of deaf education is the norm, and the days of the oral method are remembered as the dark age of deaf education. Then there was that memoir. Alec might as well have given Edward Gallaudet a loaded gun. With all these facts, it's very easy to see how Alec is controversial. But before we all jump on the Alexander Graham Bell hated deaf people train, I want to look at why Alec had these radical views. I want to read a passage from the book Reluctant Genius by Charlotte Gray because she put it into words much better than I ever could. His resolve hardened after an early encounter in Boston with a small child from New York City who was trapped in silence. The 4-year-old girl was a deaf mute, as children who could neither hear nor speak were labeled in the 19th century. It was a label with dreadful connotations. Deaf mutes were assumed to lack most educational faculties. Their families, unable to communicate with them, consigned them to residential asylums for life. The stigma attached itself to the handicapped girl's entire family. The suspicion that the condition may be genetic could ruin the marital prospects of the girl's siblings. This particular 4-year-old was causing her parents endless stress because of her violent temper tantrums. Her 2 little brothers were afraid of her. So her unhappy parents had already chosen an institution for her, and once she had been shipped off, they would likely never mention her in polite company. Warm-hearted Alec was appalled at her plight. He didn't believe she was ineducable, and he was convinced that frustration triggered her tantrums. As he wrote to his parents, the little thing gives one a most painful idea of what an uneducated deaf mute may be. This little girl stuck with Alec for his entire life. Today, being deaf is not a disability, and it's offensive to deaf people to say that it is. But back in the 19th century, it was 100% a disability, and Alec put much effort into eradicating that disability. Even though today we know that deafness is not genetic, more deaf children are born into hearing families than deaf ones, in 1884, Alec had amassed evidence that showed deafness was genetic. So his memoir was his attempt to eradicate what, in his view, was the disability of deafness. So far as his position as an oralist, I give you this succinct quote from his memoir. The constant practice of the sign language interferes with the mastery of the English language. History proved Alec wrong on almost every front. He helped usher in the dark age of deaf education, and he had, at the very least, concerning views on the deaf. I just want to end this video with a thought. He did have the interests of the deaf at heart, and maybe, just maybe, he doesn't deserve all the hatred he gets today.